Hi, welcome to this video. I would say welcome to this new video, but it's not a new video because I actually did this video before, but it got taken down for something I said. But that's okay because I'm now going to redo it and I'm going to add in detail where I missed some the first time around. So this is a new cut, and it's a video on the subject of science, and it is why science is insufficient and why it is religious. So, to get right into it, um, science is insufficient when we use it as a worldview, as a quasi-religion, and people often do that. They call it scientism. That's the term for, but I mean, when people do it, they don't call it scientism. They just do it, and it's usually accompanied by a kind of catchphrase, a tagline that goes a little something like "Follow the science." And some people will use it as a rebuke to religion, and they will say things like, believing God is stupid because you should believe in science instead, as if they are mutually exclusive and as though one can do the same job as the other. This is dumb for many different reasons. And the first reason is science is always in flux. When people say follow the science, what they mean is follow the scientific consensus. Now, the scientific consensus, which is mainly what scientific studies in a certain field find, is in flux. It differs all the time. If I do a big analysis, a meta-analysis of all of the scientific findings in psychology, let's say in personality psychology or depression, or if I do it in some physical science, like I do it in the best materials to use for an aeroplane fuselage, I will find that, first of all, the consensus is not going to be 100%. There's always going to be some studies that find something that the majority of studies don't. Perhaps that they find the opposite maybe. So there's not going to be a uniform consensus anyway. And that will change over time. It won't be the same in 2 years, 5 years, 10 years. It will be different. So generally, if you want a successful worldview, you want something that is trans-contextual, and also that can be applied to reality now, 10 years, 1,000 years, something that does not shift around. You want a solid foundation, not shifting sand. Science doesn't offer that. The Mosaic Law offers that, and the teachings and examples of Christ offer that. But science does not, and it shouldn't be used for that. Then we have the problem that science does not do semiotics, so science cannot be used to understand. I mean, science can tell us how something works, and it can also be used as kind of like divination, like it has a predictive power. Like I can come up with the odds of a disease occurring in a certain population over a certain time. I can do that with science, and it'll give you an estimate. But it can't tell you how you ought to act, how you ought to, the difference between right and wrong. It can't tell you why you exist, why it can't answer the question of why there is something, why there is reality rather than nothing. It can't do that, and it's not designed to. I will demonstrate this now using a piece of paper. Here's a piece of paper, and it's got a word on it, and it's got 3 characters, and you may think, I know those characters, I've seen them before. Well, guess what? You don't, because I made them up. I made up these characters. They're my language. They follow my linguistic rules. They're mine. And that is my creation that you just saw. And you could get the finest scientific minds in every discipline. Physics, biology, chemistry, psychology, linguistics if you wanted to. And they could tell you the tensile strength of the paper. They could tell you the chemical makeup of the ink. They could measure the characteristics of the characters if they wanted to, and they could try and predict what they might mean, but they don't have a suitable frame of reference because, like I said, it's my novel alphabet. They will never be able to find out what that word means, and they will never be able to find out why I decided to write it down either. They would have to come to me. They'd have to come to the creator to know that. Same then can apply to you, really, and to your life, and to your purpose. The only way you're going to know really is to go to the creator and ask. But that's fine, because if somebody did come and ask me about this in humility, I would just tell them. I'd tell them what it means, and I'd tell them what it means, specifically for them too. If they were very prideful, they might study that word for hours and hours and hours, and they might decide, you know what, it doesn't mean anything because I can't find the meaning. You never want to fall into that trap, but that's the trap that scientism lays for us. Another problem with scientism is that science is observation, and we observe with our mind, we observe with our conscious awareness. And if scientism is true, then our mind must emerge from our brains. Our consciousness must be a product of the sharing of electrical potential between neurons. It must be that neurons communicate electrochemically using synapses in networks through our brains. And that process makes consciousness. Consciousness emerges from it. If that's true, then our consciousness is not designed to work out why we're here or how we should act or what the reality is. Then our consciousness is just the byproduct of a brain which is developed to search out food and shelter and keep us safe from various, from being predated upon, and also to pass on our DNA. So you wouldn't trust it with science anyway. It doesn't make any sense. If it's wrong, which it is, then our consciousness doesn't actually emerge from brain activity. I'm not saying the brain doesn't interact with consciousness, because it absolutely does. We see that in neural correlates. There are neural correlates for all sorts of conscious experiences, which just goes to further the point as well. Nothing correlates with itself. Doesn't make any sense. But yeah, there are neural correlates things, but there are also times when those correlates break down. So there are times when, towards the end of life, for example, people with Alzheimer's or dementia, what have you, regain lucidity, despite the fact that their neuronal hardware should not be able to do that, but it does it anyway. You get reports of very rich, intense cognition, despite very low or absent brain activity, so with hallucinogenic drugs or meditative states. People with hydrocephalus, reduced brain tissue, where you've got more like kind of fluid build up rather than active, like working brain tissue, and yet they seem to possess cognitive abilities that they shouldn't have. You get split brain patients, people whose the bridge between the two hemispheres of the brain, the corpus callosum, is split. They should have two consciousnesses there, but they don't. They have one unified consciousness. So there are plenty of examples of how this doesn't really work. And the broader term for why consciousness should not follow from, or rather, the broader term for the difficulty in working out how consciousness could possibly emerge from the non-conscious, inanimate particles that make up brain cells and glial matter and all that sort of stuff, that makes up your nervous system, is called the hard problem of consciousness. And it's called the hard problem of consciousness because it hasn't been solved, and it's not going to be. At least it's not going to be if people keep kind of going at it with a bias, and the bias is materialism. And I think it's safe to say, and I'm going out on a limb here, I guess, but I think it's safe to say that comes from scientism. So we get actual kind of neuroscientists who have a bit of this scientism about them, because they're not really open to the idea that consciousness is not emergent from the brain, even though, the data is pretty clear. It can't be. But anyway, so we've got that problem with why scientism doesn't work. It's not really supported. Scientism is a product of consciousness, but it can't explain consciousness. So we've got a problem. It's falling at the very first hurdle. You've also got another problem here, which is how science is interpreted, and this comes down to statistics. So if you don't like statistics, feel free to skip this. But also, if you don't like statistics, don't worry, because I'm not going to go very in depth here. I'm just going to very quickly say that when people read scientific articles, well, first off, people don't. The kind of people who say follow the science don't read scientific articles. They don't read peer-reviewed journals. They rely on a priestly class of scientists who have their own little esoteric groups, and they have a little kind of vestment of a white coat, and they write down their findings or and also just their views, just their ideologies in books and articles. And then the people who say kind of follow the science go to them. So they have this ironically kind of religious structure to how they understand science anyway. But even when they do, they will more often than not understand the very basic building blocks of how to understand scientific findings. And these are in two statistics. One is a p-value and one is a confidence interval. These are the basic building blocks. Obviously, there's way more statistical values that can be used to understand science as it's carried out, but p-values and confidence intervals are like the bases that you need to understand before you can even begin to be scientifically literate. Okay, so to have a look at p-values and confidence intervals just in more detail, we'll have a look at some science, and here's some science here, and we'll have a look at this article about gambling, engagement, mental health, other stuff in UK Armed Forces personnel. This is something I was involved in a while ago. And if we go down, we got all these findings, and we'll find some with some p-values attached at some point. They're right down here. So we have not harmful gambling, harmful gambling. So we got kind of two populations, and this is people who, in one group, they found to engage in what you could consider to be harmful gambling, in the other group, not harmful gambling. This isn't too important. It could be two groups of anything, really. It could be, Alzheimer's, dementia. It doesn't even have to be human populations. It's just got to be comparisons being made. And here we have a comparison of male and female on these outcomes, and you've got a p-value. And this p-value is less than 0.05. It's significantly less than that. So when researchers report the results, they'll often say something like, we found a difference and the p-value was less than 0.05. That's significant. And many people, even practicing, even scientists, think that means we can be 95% sure the findings are real. But that's not what a p-value means. A p-value is the probability of seeing results at least as extreme as the ones you observed if the null hypothesis were true. So if there really were no difference. So if p equals 0.05, that means if there really were no difference, then in the long run, you'd expect results as extreme as yours, or extreme as these, about 5% of the time. It does not mean there's a 5% chance that the null is true. It does not mean that you're 95% sure your hypothesis is right. It's just a measure of how surprising your data would be under the assumption that the null is true, where there would be no effect. So that's the correct way of understanding the p-value. We've also got a confidence interval. That's CI, stands for confidence interval. This stands for odd ratio. Don't worry about that for the moment. And we can see, okay, we've got a value of 3.13, and we've got a confidence interval that ranges from 1 and a bit to 7 and a bit. So that range is the confidence interval. So this is the other important kind of statistic. So a 95% confidence interval gives a range of values that are most consistent with your data and the model you're using. For example, if you find a difference with a 95% confidence interval, and that range is from 1 and a bit, 7 a bit, that means if you could repeat that study exactly as you did, many, many times. And each time you calculated a confidence interval at 95%, then about 95% of those intervals that you calculate would contain the true effect. And this confidence interval is one of those intervals. What it doesn't mean, it's not correct to say there's a 95% chance that the true value is between 1 and a bit and 7 and a bit. The true value is fixed. The interval either does or it doesn't contain it. And the 95% refers to the method, not this one interval. So, still, the width of the interval tells you how precise your estimate is. So a narrow interval is a precise estimate, and the wide one is less precise. So, and if the confidence interval includes 0, if it goes through 0, like from -1 to +1 or something, then it's not significant anyway. You don't need to worry about it. So all of this matters because a small p-value tells you your data would be unlikely if there were no real effect, but it doesn't prove your hypothesis. A confidence interval tells you the range of effect sizes that fit your data and how precise your estimate is. So when reading scientific studies, don't just look for p equals less than 0.05. Ask, what does the confidence interval say? Is it large enough to matter? Is the estimate precise? And also, look for p equals less than 0.05. You might see different values there. You might even have somebody writing an article and saying that they found something to be significant, and it's the value is greater than 0.05. In which case, you've got to ask yourself, well, is that significant? By whose standards are we saying that is? So always remember, p-values, confidence intervals, they deal with probability and confidence, not absolute truths. Confidence coming from the Latin confide, to have faith. And science itself is not about certainty. It's about measuring how strongly data supports different possibilities. It should not be used as a source of irrefutable truth, in the way that people who kind of have a scientism worldview do. So that's just what I've got to say on that. There's another aspect to this, and this is the other part of this video which I'm coming to, which is that science is religious. What do I mean by that? Well, when science is done properly, and I mean this from my my own work, I will engage in science in a certain order. There will be an initial observation, and then there'll be a question about that. So it'll be like, a certain population tends to get a disease more than the other one, or tends to get, ill more than the other, more than the general population. So then you'd say, okay, well, we've got to have a question here, and the question is just formalizing that. Is this population at greater risk for X disorder than the general population? Then you go, okay, well, we've got our question. We had better look around the existing literature, make sure that nobody's looked at this before, or is there a gap to fill? Oh, great, there is. Now we develop our hypothesis and our null hypothesis. So hypothesis is, if we measure for this disease using whatever measure at 0 months and at 12 months, we will find elevated rates in this population compared to the other one, compared to the general population. And we can control for sex and age and all that sort of stuff. And the null hypothesis will say there'll be no difference. And then we'll design our study, and we'll carry out our study, and we'll collect all our data, and we'll analyze our data, and then we'll communicate it by trying to get it published in a journal. And it's got to be done in this order. It can't be done. You can't swap it around. Like, I can't analyze my data before I've collected it. I can't make my initial observation after I've developed my hypotheses. It doesn't make any sense. It all falls apart. So it's this predictable linear set of complex behaviors. That's a ritual. It is also guided by an ethic. The ethic is, thou shalt not bear false witness. Because if you come into doing science with an ulterior motive, like if you want to sell drugs, or maybe you want to discredit drugs, maybe you want to do lots of things, you're not going to be going into it with the spirit of truth. It will fall apart again. You'll end up fiddling your data. You'll end up sitting on findings that you don't find convenient. Before you know it, there is no science, because the ethic has not held it together. And if the ethic is applied, the ritual is engaged in, what do we get at the end? Well, we get a revelation. Because that difference in the prevalence of, let's say, a disease between groups, or that difference in the efficacy of a treatment, or the effectiveness of a material, whatever it is you're looking at, that truth existed before you looked for it. It was really there. What you've done is you've engaged in a ritual guided by an ethic, and it's been revelatory. You've revealed a hitherto unknown truth about the universe. And now, if that's not religious, I don't know what is. Um, you know, you can compare that to the mass. You go to the mass. It's a complex set of rituals. Just like science, you can't mess around with the order. If you do, it won't make any sense. It's guided by various ethics. It is guided by the ethics handed down to us from God, and it has to be engaged with in the right spirit, and it's revelatory. You learn things about yourself, you learn things about the universe, you learn things about God, you learn things about each other by engaging in it. And it also has a kind of pro-social abstract thing about it, like it bonds people together. That's one of the kind of consequences of engaging in it. Same as science. You communicate your findings, you work with other people, you share the information you get. It's a binding thing. If we compare it to another ritual, like having dinner with your family, you can't cook the dinner after you served it. It's got to be in order, and it's guided by an ethic of you love one another, and you show your respect to your father and your mother, and you sit down with each other. It's got this pro-social thing. It's not just about intake of calories. So it's ritualistic, it's guided by an ethic, and it's revelatory too. You learn about each other, you learn about each other's day, you bond together through that revelation. Science is no different. It's the same sort of thing. And that said, I'm not saying that science is just this wonderful, great thing. It can be absolutely sacral. So, and there's plenty of philosophers who have said this, that, engaging in science is learning about God's creation, and that in itself is an act of worship, and I absolutely believe that. But of course, it's not good like God is. Science can be used for good. It can be used to understand the world around us, make our lives better, help us learn, live healthy lives, give glory to God, all of that. But of course, it can also be used to for absolute evils. And in today's age, you will see that a lot, from weapons to surgically altering bodies out of some awful cursed search for comfort or the avoidance of kind of psychological pain, or blind faith in an ideology that doesn't have your best wishes at heart, or the development of harmful drugs and what have you. So science is not it's not like a kind of a good in itself. It's got to be applied in the right way. But the bottom line, I think, is that if you want to understand reality, if you want to understand yourself, if you understand why there is something rather than nothing, don't use science to answer those questions. Use science for what it's supposed to be used for, and it can be a wonderful thing. I would encourage anyone who thinks about, maybe I'd like to make a career out of that, go ahead and do it. But if you want answers to the other big questions, the questions that kind of gnaw at your heart, then go to church, talk to God, and you'll get the answers there. Anyway, hope you enjoyed this. Hope somebody got something from this, and thanks a lot.